There's a lot more to ReZero than I originally thought. At first, I just thought it was a fun time from start to finish, and that was about it. But there's a lot more to this show if you look a bit deeper. From some really great directing work to a soundtrack that is fantastically rich and luscious. I might make a video about it one of these days, but here I want to focus on the story, because there's a lot that I think you could say about it. For a story set in a well-established genre, it's told in a really strange way, one that you might think would be at odds with the kind of story it is. But by creating a narrative in the way he does, I think author Teppei Nagatsuki is able to craft a nuanced look into loneliness. This is a story about someone who, when pressed on all sides, uses only his inability to give up as a weapon. So it's a story about not giving up. This is what author Teppei Nagatsuki said about his story, ReZero Starting Life in Another World, first released as a web novel in 2012, then published as a light novel series in 2014. Here I'll mostly be talking about the first season of the show, broadcast in 2016, and covers most of the events in the first 9 volumes of the light novels. The story is about Subaru Nagatsuki, who is suddenly transported to another world and follows his wonderful time in the city of Lagunica. The story is about Subaru, who is transported to another world and follows his struggles in Lagunica. Everything about this story is dictated by the premise of Subaru not giving up, and explains a lot of the really bizarre choices. Because if you take a step back and look at this show as a whole, the setup for this story is really strange. It takes place in a fantasy world with a well-thought-out magic system, politics, and lore, in a show that isn't all that interested in those things. Most of the world building in the books was cut out. You have a protagonist summoned to that world for a reason that remains a mystery, even after 9 volumes, whose one power is the fact that they can't really die. While the world building is something stories can delve into later on, the fact that there's no real overarching goal and that Subaru is functionally immortal seems really strange. It would make it seem like there are no stakes. In a fantasy story, if the protagonist has no goals, what can they do? What could they gain? And if they can't die, how can you challenge them in any meaningful way? What kind of story could you possibly tell? However, for anyone who has seen the show, it's pretty apparent that there's still something here, because the foundation that this story is built on revolves entirely around the relationships Subaru makes. Part of what makes Return by Death such a powerful plot device is the fact that you can learn a lot from Subaru's interactions with others. By meeting people for the first time more than once, it can reveal some telling things. Take Subaru's first encounter with Emilia. You get a lot more story and character development for her by trying to figure out why she said her name was Satella rather than having her reveal that information herself. Having more of these interactions, investing us in the characters' lives and safety, is much more compelling than having a grand overarching goal in a story that's focused on Subaru as a person. And so, for the most part, you can get a functional plot from this setup. In order for the story to progress, Subaru needs to become a better person to save the people he loves. But it's not enough to test Subaru physically, or even have him watch awful events play out in front of his eyes. For a story where Subaru cannot die, to truly test his only weapon in this world, you need to break his will to live. To me, the most important element in this part of the story is the fact that Subaru cannot talk about his power. And it's terrifying to watch just how effectively this mechanic is used. It solves a lot of problems logistically. If Subaru could just tell everyone what happens in the future, it would break the show entirely. But to me, it speaks to the much broader point that I think Nagatsuki was trying to make. Beyond the shock and horror that the show does so well, the thing that stuck out to me was how this story portrays loneliness. Subaru can only progress if he can save everyone. The only way he can is by becoming a better person. But it's a learning process. Every time he and everyone around him dies, it's a failure of his character. While he can return by death and try again, it doesn't take away how traumatic of an experience that can be. Because to Subaru, he still hurt everyone he cares about, even if they don't know it. Subaru watches over and over as everything he does leads to disaster, all because he wasn't the person he needed to be for the people he loves. It's a burden that Subaru carries with him throughout every loop, a weight that gets heavier the more he fails. And the only thing that might ease his soul is the one thing he cannot do. He can't talk to anyone about what he's been through. Every time before he dies, Subaru gains lived experience, good and bad. He can fall in love, create meaningful relationships, or endure the most excruciating pain of his life. But the moment he returns, they all become memories that only exist in his mind. Everyone around Subaru will see that he's in distress, but they will never understand why. In that way, Subaru is completely alone. A lot of the time, stories will showcase the struggle of personal growth, but not many explore just how lonely of a process that is, to constantly fail at becoming the person you want to be. ReZero highlights a state of mind that I think is pretty difficult to put into words. I can relate to many of the emotions Subaru goes through. The feeling of being so desperate to change yourself, but being unable to communicate those feelings. It can make you latch onto people in an unhealthy way, unfairly placing the burden of change on them when they can't help you in the way you want. It can fill you with complete despair when everything you do seems in vain. The powerlessness when nothing seems to change. And you can start to believe one of the most heinous delusions of all, believing that the bravest thing you can do when you start to hate yourself for everything you've done is to disappear, because everyone's lives would be better if you just weren't in them. There is nothing in this story that can physically threaten Subaru in a narrative sense. He may not have the physical strength to face villains, but because of his power, he will always survive. So instead, Nagatsuki traps Subaru in his own head, filling it with despair and loneliness, and taking away his ability to communicate, crushing Subaru's soul from the inside. It's not easy to deal with these emotions. It can be incredibly difficult to process by yourself. The story wisely removes death from this struggle because the question of whether or not Subaru will live isn't the point. It's whether or not he can change himself. What Nagatsuki created with this story is a character study that aims to completely destroy everything about who Subaru once was, and how that process is lonely and personal. No one in the show ever tells Subaru what he needs to do. All they can ever do is support him when he's strayed off the path. The transformation Subaru must go down is one that only he can navigate, and fighting off the isolation and despair that results from that process is at the heart of what happens in this season. It makes sense then that the final villain he must face is everything Subaru hates about himself. Beetlejuice Romanicanti embodies all the worst parts of Subaru that need to change, the end result of what can happen when this twisted soul is left to fester and rot. The only way for Beetlejuice to be defeated is if Subaru can fight against the lonely process of change and destroy everything in himself that Beetlejuice represents. If any of it remains intact, the story makes it clear how easy it can be to become that person once again. No matter how difficult, painful, and lonely that process is, we must persevere to make that transformation possible. Anything less, and we can succumb to sloth. With his story, Nagatsuki posed the question, you have the protagonist struggle and not give up. Now by doing all of that, what does he gain in the end? And to me, the answer is resolve, the strength to fight a lonely fight. ReZero is a textbook example of dark fantasy, a genre that imbues fantasy tropes with horror. It's not an escapist work. It's one that makes us face deep and uncomfortable emotions and asks us to confront them head on. In this story, we see how terrifying loneliness can be, and puts into words a type of feeling that's hard to comprehend. To me, that's what makes ReZero so fascinating. I have no idea what happens next in this story. I haven't read past volume 9 of the light novels. I'd imagine that we'll explore more of this world now that Subaru is better equipped to face its problems, but I'll just have to see. In a story completely devoted to the idea of challenging Subaru's character, I'm sure he's now up to the task of facing what might happen, whatever it is.
Subaru.
At least,
レムって
for now.
誰のこと？
So I just want to say thank you so much for all the support that I've gotten on my last video. A lot more people saw it than I was expecting. It's been amazing and honestly a bit horrifying considering all the mistakes I made. So I'll be more careful with that kind of stuff. But again, thank you. I hope to make more and better things in the future. I'd be happy for all of you guys to stick around.